Today, 18th May, the ground still shakes after the huge summit meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping in Beijing, an event which has, I think, confirmed the enormous shift in the tectonic plates. Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, in fact, former top CIA analyst, the man who, more than anyone else within the US intelligence community, highlighted in the 1960s the existence of a Sino-Soviet split, something which at that time within the US intelligence community was widely denied, and who for some time in recent years has been highlighting, on the contrary, the depth of the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership, has a most interesting article discussing this topic in Consortium News, which I'm going to return to later in this program. But anyway, suffice to say that in the aftermath of this colossal summit meeting in Beijing, and following the return of all the top military officers from Moscow after their various meetings with Putin, consequent upon the switch of defense ministers, Belarusov taking over from Shoigu. Anyway, after those events as well, we're getting more news from the Ukrainian battlefronts. And the news collectively continues to be very bad for Ukraine. In fact, I would say that the situation overall is going from merely critical to something worse, and this is true across every single battlefront. Now, I'm going to say that there is a lot of tantalizing discussion and rumor about another major Russian incursion in Sumy region. That's on the north, in the northern borders between northern borders of Russia and Ukraine, where two important cities, Sumy and Chernigov, are located. There's said to be satellite photos showing the construction by the Russians of all sorts of military facilities, what appear to be military facilities across the border from Sumy region. The Ukrainians are extremely concerned about this build-up, and Russian artillery and missile strikes in this area have been very active in recent days, and also there are multitudes of reports of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups regularly crossing the border in this area as well. And there's also pictures and film of the true state of Ukrainian fortifications in this area also. I saw a film of a car driving along a road in this precise area of Ukraine, and one could see large numbers of concrete blocks, which I understand were dragon's teeth, intended to be laid out along the fortified lines, basically in heaps along the roadside, left unattended and certainly not planted in any fortified positions. So it looks as if the fortifications in Sumy region are as mythical as the fortifications in Kharkiv region turned out to be. Now, I don't know whether or not the Russians really are planning some kind of incursion in Sumy region. All the indications are that they probably are. But for the moment at least, since this is a plan, a possible plan that the Russians might have rather than an ongoing operation, and since I have repeatedly found it extremely difficult to second guess what the Russian General Staff are planning, I'm going to skip further discussion of this key area. I'm just going to make quickly two fairly obvious points. The first is that, of course, if the Russians do open, or rather reopen, another front in this area, of course they were present here in 2022 also, but if they do reopen another front here, where they have basically not been since they withdrew from this area at the end of March 2022, then it will put enormous stress on a Ukrainian military that is now, so far as I can see, disastrously and catastrophically overstretched along the entire line of contact. I mean, that is obvious. It's something that the Ukrainians themselves must be extremely worried about, and in fact, pretty much they're already admitting to it. The second thing is to say that Sumy region is an interesting region in terms of its geography and its relevance to this particular conflict, because we're talking about quite a large area. So an incursion into Sumy region, if it takes place in some locations on the border, would be relevant to a general operation connected to the ongoing events in Kharkiv region, where, of course, the Russians, under less than a week ago, began an offensive. But, of course, if the Russians advance into Sumy region further to the west, then that might bring them closer to Kiev itself, Ukraine's capital. And here I should say that Putin, as we will see shortly, has been talking an awful lot about Kiev recently. Now, let me repeat again, I'm not guessing what the Russians are going to do. I don't have the knowledge. The general staff in Moscow, General Gerasimov and his officials, absolutely do not share their thinking and their plans with me. So I don't know. There have been lots of rumors that General Surovikin has returned to Moscow. Supposedly he met with Putin in the Kremlin just before Putin met with the other military district commanders. Now, he wasn't present in that meeting. I've checked and I can see clearly that he was not one of the officers who attended that meeting. Though General Lapin, with whom Surovikin has worked closely in the past, basically they captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk together. General Lapin was prominently represented at that meeting. He was present, and there's lots of pictures. The Kremlin released lots of pictures specifically of him. But, well, who knows? Maybe Surovikin was there, though not at the meeting itself. Maybe he had a brief meeting before with Putin. Maybe he's being earmarked as the commander of the operation in Sumy region. Just saying. Anyway, let's wait and see. Now, let's talk about what is actually going on the battlefronts. And the first place we will turn to is Kharkiv, where the Russians are continuing their ongoing operation. And this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that the village of Staritsa, close to Volchansk, has now fallen completely under Russian control. And as I think I discussed yesterday, there's a significant amount of information that the Russians have not only cleared, or practically cleared, the area of Volchansk north of the Volcha River, but that they have also entered Volchansk from the east, that they've captured various other villages to the east of Volchansk, and that they're now in a position to strike at Volchansk from the east as well. Fighting in this area is very intense. There's large numbers of Ukrainian troops apparently concentrated in Volchansk itself, south of the Volcha River, as I discussed yesterday. Raidovka the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk that appears to have reporters on the ground and which is very well informed about military developments, and clearly, by the way, has some professional military analysts who are working for it. Anyway, Redovka says that the defenses, the Ukrainian defense in Volchansk, is too hurriedly put together, cobbled together. There's too many troops, Ukrainian troops, from too many disparate units. The fortifications within southern Volchansk have not been organized properly or built up properly. And the result is that the Russians are able to shell and bomb southern Volchansk, inflicting appalling casualties on the Ukrainian troops there. And Redovka is suggesting that even though when the Russians do launch the main attack on southern Volchansk, obviously the Ukrainians will put up resistance. Anyway, Redovka doesn't seem to think that that resistance will continue for very long. What is indisputable is that the Russians appear to have complete aerial dominance, not just over Volchansk, but over the entire area of the Kharkiv operation. Their aircraft, their helicopters are very active in this area. They're conducting large numbers of missile strikes with their Iskander-M missiles and their Tornado precision-guided multiple launch rocket systems. They're equivalent to the HIMARS and other cheaper, unguided multiple rocket launch systems. And of course their drones, especially their Lancet drones, have been very active indeed. And it's been suggested, in fact, that this is the densest area of use of Lancet drones in any place and at any time over the entire course of the special military operation. And the Ukrainians supposedly are losing armor, large amounts of armor, on the roads to Volchansk. They've been trying to send armored vehicles and men along the roads to Volchansk, and they have been devastated by Russian drone strikes. Well, I'm going to say, if so, this is not fully coming through in the Russian Defense Ministry updates, but the Russian Defense Ministry often holds back information about developments on a particular battlefront, and this might be the case with this one. Anyway, further west, in the other place which is of importance to the Russians, the village of Lipsy, there's been less news. The Russians do seem to have entered Lipsy itself, but the fighting again here is intense. Again, the Ukrainians have cobbled together some kind of a defense within Lipsy, using large numbers of troops from disparate battalions, all taken from various formations along the line of contact. And there is a general acceptance now across the Western media and in Ukraine, and I assume amongst Western militaries and Western capitals and amongst Western intelligence officers, that the primary purpose, one of the purposes of this incursion into Kharkiv is again to overstretch Ukraine's defense lines, to put extreme pressure on a Ukrainian military, which it is now universally acknowledged is running out of men. And here there's been lots of articles about the extent of Ukraine's manpower crisis. There is, for example, a rather shattering article today in the Daily Telegraph about Ukrainian conscripts that are being pulled together to fight, thrown back into the battle, and it goes with the rather terrifying title, "Out of the Slaughterhouse into the meat grinder for Ukraine's recruits. For conscripts called into service, the journey from their previous lives to the front line is fraught with physical and mental peril. And I'm not going to discuss the contents of the article, which are harrowing. Suffice to say that one Ukrainian conscript bursts into tears when he's reminded of his wife and children, who he is far from confident that he's going to see again. But perhaps the greatest and most shattering revelation in this article is that the survival rate of Ukrainian infantry is now very low. We're told that life expectancy is short in frontline infantry units, where casualty rates can be as high as 70% dead or wounded. 70% dead or wounded. Now, we're not told over what time period, but my sense is that that relates to events that happen over relatively short periods in specific battles. And that's in the Daily Telegraph. That's not a Russian propaganda or media outlet that's telling us that Ukrainian units can suffer losses of up to 70%. Now, I read over the last 24 hours an article, I think it was somewhere in the American media, the US media, that spoke about some units in the Ukrainian military being down to 40% strength. And I also read, I think it was in the same article, about how Ukraine is being asked to, rather is being compelled to move elite units from one part of the front line to another in a constant, keeping them in constant motion as they act as fire brigades trying to stop Russian breakthroughs in any part of the front line where the situation is becoming critical. And the result is that these units are becoming worn out. They're suffering extremely heavy losses. By definition, and this is something that is obvious to me from following this war, a military unit that is deployed to a particular location, to new area of ground, it's best if it's not thrown into the battle immediately. It needs to keep track of what is going on and to get to learn the ground well before it should be thrown into battle. And of course, if it's simply thrown into battle over ground that it doesn't know or understand, and which the soldiers don't know and understand, then it's going to suffer heavier losses than it would do in areas which it is more familiar with. But that increasingly is the destiny of Ukraine's elite units, as they are rotated from one part of the battlefront to another without being given adequate rest or resupply or re-equipping. And anyway, that was one further article that I saw. And we are told also that Ukraine now is desperately short of air defense systems. And this is coming from Zelensky himself. He tells us that Ukraine, the situation at the moment on the Kharkiv battlefront, well, he puts it like this: I won't say it's a great success for Russia, but we have to be sober and understand that they are going deeper into our territory. Today we have about 25% of what we need to defend Ukraine. I'm talking about air defense. The situation in Kharkiv is controlled but not stabilized. Now, what that means, I'm far from clear what he means by controlled but not stabilized. For the record, it looks as if Ukraine is suffering heavy losses in the Kharkiv direction, and that the Russians are still advancing, especially in Volchansk, but they will be also advancing, no doubt, I have no doubt of this whatsoever, in Lipsy as well before very long. So, battle, complicated, and he says that Ukraine has only got 25% of the air defense that it needs, and he's demanding more Patriot systems, more IRIS-Ts, more SAMP-Ts, more of every single type of air defense system that the West can provide. But of course, these air defense systems are in extremely short supply. The US military has only a relatively small number of Patriot missile systems to defend the entire American landmass, just saying. They have dozens of them, scores of them, but if you look at the size of the United States, the enormous territory of the United States, there would obviously be significant gaps in the coverage in the event of a missile attack, and we're starting to see that missile attacks are becoming a real possibility in modern war. But anyway, the United States is now facing demands from Zelensky to send more. This, despite the fact that the US military seems to be unhappy at this, and the Europeans obviously are facing more and further demands also to send more air defense systems. They're desperately short of air defense systems in Europe now, but they're obliged to send them. And in fact, European militaries, and this is, I think, a critical thing to say, instead of becoming stronger in the face of the supposed Russian threat, which supposedly overshadows the entirety of Europe, the reality is that as more and more valuable equipment is shipped off to Ukraine, more ammunition, more air defense assets, more tanks, armored vehicles, more artillery, as it's all shipped off to Ukraine, much faster than it can be produced to be destroyed by the Russians there. The European militaries in general across NATO are becoming weaker. This is not something that is generally acknowledged in the West, but it is irrefutably true. In fact, there are lots of NATO officers who I know for a fact are becoming increasingly alarmed about the situation, and there's even a few of them, principally in Germany, who are starting to speak out about it. But anyway, Zelensky demands still more. He presumably, if he's only got a quarter of the air defense assets that he needs, he presumably wants the Europeans and the Americans to treble supplies of air defense assets, given shortages in production, limits of production. That can only mean stripping the American military and the European militaries of still more air defense assets. We'll see whether they're prepared to do that. But if they are, I can advise them in advance that it is not going to make the difference that they expect. In one of his most recent videos, Brian Beletic has explained this superbly well. He's pointed out that with the general shortage of air defense missiles and with the low rate of air defense missiles in the West, and with the need to launch at least 2 missiles at any one target, at any one Russian cruise missile, in order to have some confidence of shooting down that missile. There is absolutely no way that the West can keep up. The Russians have shown that they have the ability to keep producing weapons and missiles at rates that the West simply cannot match, and attempting to do so will simply drain the West's already depleted stock of air defense missiles. But, of course, that's not what Zelensky wants to hear. He's also demanding 120 to 130 F-16 fighter jets and other advanced aircraft. There's reports, by the way, that Ukrainian pilots have also been training on Mirage 2000s, a French fighter jet dating from the same era as the F-16. Anyway, he wants more aircraft, 120 to 130 F-16s. That would still be massively outmatched by the far more powerful Russian Air Force, and given the immense difficulties in operating even the relatively small number of F-16s that the West is supplying to Ukraine, how is Ukraine going to be able to absorb and operate the numbers of aircraft that Zelensky is demanding? Where will it find the pilots? When are the pilots going to be trained? Which airfields will these aircraft take off from? The whole thing is a study in hopelessness. But of course, again, the fact that Zelensky is talking in this way highlights the catastrophic nature of the situation. And we've had two more reports from the US media about the situation. The first about basically confirming how bad the situation is. There's a further report that the Ukrainians have asked for more trainers to be provided, more advisors and more trainers to be provided by the United States. To my mind, that article containing that request corroborates the first of those two articles recently published by Stephen Bryan, which made such a stir. One can recall that Stephen Bryan said that as Ukraine's situation deteriorates, the West is going to supply more and more advisors to Ukraine, just as it supplied once long ago more and more advisors to South Vietnam, leading ultimately to a situation where those advisors, who are not just advisors, but really special forces troops who will engage inevitably in some combat missions, how that places the West and the United States itself on the slippery slope towards ultimate open troop deployments. Anyway, Ukraine is asking for these advisors. The United States for the moment is prevaricating, but General Brown, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who one would expect to be speaking out and warning against the unwisdom of this step, even whilst saying that for the moment he doesn't believe that sending large numbers of advisors is appropriate. He says, remarkably and alarmingly, that at some point their dispatch to Ukraine is going to become inevitable. Well, we'll see whether that really happens, because of course events on the ground might ultimately dictate a change of course, but we can see that which Stephen Bryan warned about is starting to become true. And of course, again, to be clear, it is a product of growing dismay and desperation and no little panic. Anyway, that was one report. There is another even more alarming and even more concerning report, which is that the Ukrainians are now apparently pleading with the US for permission to undertake missile strikes deep into Russia, something that the Russians themselves have given very powerful warnings against. I would not be surprised if over the next couple of days we see the American ambassador called into the foreign ministry in Moscow to be given a strong warning from the Russians about the risks of taking any such step. The Russians have, of course, recently given the identical warning to the British. And apparently the Ukrainians are not only asking for permission to launch missiles deep into Russia, and here one has to understand that what they mean clearly are ATACMS missiles and perhaps ultimately German Taurus missiles, assuming Germany ever supplies them. But they're also apparently also asking the United States for help with targeting data. And the explanation, again, is not difficult to understand. Ukraine's attempts to launch major drone strikes against Russia have proved completely ineffectual. Ukraine's attempts to adapt old Soviet jet-powered reconnaissance drones into cruise missiles, well, they failed as well. They've done minimal damage, and it's likely anyway that Ukraine has run out of these old Yastreb drones. And one way or the other, the Ukrainians can't take the war to the Russians, as clearly they're aching to do, unless the United States gives them the green light to use American missiles and American weapons to launch deep strikes into Russia. An enormously alarming request, a very concerning request. It seems that for the moment the United States is resisting and saying no. I hope that sticks, because of course if the United States does agree to do this, then we are again further up the escalator into an increasingly dangerous situation indeed. But to reiterate, all of this is a product of increasing Ukrainian desperation on the battlefield. I read somewhere that the Ukrainian military that's now fighting the Russians is now apparently reduced to something like 250,000 men. I'm not sure how big the Russian military is, but I suspect it is much, much bigger. And I also read recently that Ukraine has now revised downwards its expectations of the number of troops it can conscript under its new mobilization law. A couple of months ago, back at the end of last year, we were told that General Zaluzhny, who was at that time still Ukraine's overall military commander, the General Zaluzhny wanted 500,000 men, 500,000 men. We're now getting reports that Ukraine expects in total to conscript around 100 to 150,000. Most of them conscripts with no military experience or recent military experience, people who have not served in war and who will require comprehensive training, which Ukraine itself might be struggling to give. So, a very bad situation, a critical situation, and one that is resulting in increasingly urgent and desperate demands from Kiev for more surface-to-air missiles than the West, in practical terms, has got, more shells than the West, in practical terms, has got. We saw that President Pavel, who yesterday was reported as demanding or calling for peace negotiations, it seems clear to me that his hopes of finding 800,000 shells for Ukraine on the international market, international arms market, has evaporated into the air. Anyway, the West facing unlimited demands for shells, for surface-to-air missiles, also desperately short of men, and apparently increasingly out of equipment, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery pieces as well. A crisis that's starting to affect the entire battlefield. And let's turn again to what is going on elsewhere on the battlefields. Now, I mentioned yesterday that I noticed that the Russians were saying that in their latest Ministry of Defense reports that they have advanced closer to Ukrainian positions in Krasny Liman. And in fact, it looks as if what is happening is that the Russians are now making significant advances in the Kupiansk area, taking advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians are having to strip their units along the front line, the line of contact, of battalions of forces to redeploy to Kharkiv and perhaps potentially Sumy region as well. Anyway, it looks as if the major Russian advance now, after the fall of the villages of Kislovka and Kotlerovka to the Russians, that the major advance is towards a place called Borova. And Borova does indeed lie reasonably close to Liman, though it's not specifically close to Liman. It's north of Liman on the Oskol River line, but it's also, importantly, quite close to Izium. Izium lies directly across from Borova, west of the Oskol River. Now, I will say straight away that I've not completely understood how it has happened that the Russians have been able to advance in this area so quickly and how they've found themselves in this location. But that apparently there is an advance, is indeed taking place. Well, we've had a confirmation of this from TASS, and we're told this Russian troops advanced towards Borovaya in eastern Kharkiv region, and the person who's providing us this information is Vitaly Ganshev, who is or was the head of the military civilian administration, the Russian appointed, I should say, military civilian administration in Kharkiv region. His base before autumn 2022 was the city of Kupiansk. Anyway, we are told that Ganshev says there are certain results in other areas of the Kharkiv front. One of them is in the Svatovo-Kupiansk area, where our soldiers managed to advance towards Borovaya, and they're continuing to improve their positions. The official added that as of today, more than 200 square kilometers of Kharkiv region have been liberated. Well, that's what he would say, from the Ukrainian armed forces. The main city on the verge of liberation, of which we are now, is Volchansk. Fighting is ongoing, and we can say that in each street retaken from the enemy, there is the result of severe and difficult battles. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians are advancing now fairly rapidly towards the Oskol River line. It's not clear, of course, what they're going to do, whether they're planning to cross the Oskol River to retake those territories. Liman, which is actually also west of the Zherebets River, whether they intend to retake Liman and Izium and Balakleya and Kupiansk itself. But one way or the other, it does look as if the Russians, as I've discussed in my last two videos, are now returning in force to Kharkiv region. They seem to be intent on reoccupying all of the territory in Kharkiv region that they ceded to Ukraine over the course of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. And of course, if they start an offensive in Sumy region, then the Russians would be perhaps edging closer towards Kiev as well. So anyway, that is one report that we've had from the Russians. Medvedev, by the way, has weighed in recently, and he's saying this in response to Zelensky's comments, or rather the reports from the West about the Ukrainians asking for permission to launch missile strikes into Russia. Medvedev, whose job now, as far as I can see, apart from being deputy chair of the Security Council, is to write polemical pieces, provocative pieces on Telegram. Anyway, Medvedev has said that if these long-range missiles are indeed provided to Ukraine and that the Ukrainians are indeed given the green light to use them against Russian territory, then at a minimum, the Russian buffer zone will have to be expanded by at least 550 kilometers. And of course, that will take them deep into Ukraine, into central Ukraine as well. Once the Kiev regime uses Storm Shadow Scalp missiles with a range of at least 550 kilometers, when the distance between Belgorod and Kiev is 409 kilometers, practically the entire central and most of western parts of Ukraine will fall into this buffer zone. In other words, there must be Russia everywhere, 550 kilometers plus or minus a further 70 to 100 kilometers in order to be sure. Otherwise, the security of our cities and villages cannot be guaranteed. If it goes on like this, the guaranteed sanitary zone will be somewhere at the border of Poland or even inside Poland. Anyway, that's what Medvedev said. So anyway, we'll see whether the Russians really do decide to cross the Oskol River. But at the moment, it looks likely. I think that there is now a fairly widespread view in Russia that though the decision to withdraw from Kharkiv region in the autumn of 2022 was the correct one, given Ukrainian manpower superiority, this ultimately proved to be essential territory for the Russians to control, and they need to be back there in force in order to secure the position of their forces, of their towns and villages in the west of Russia. So that's a very interesting situation developing in Kupiansk region. There's reports that in Seversk region, the Russians are now once again advancing inside the village of Belogorovka. Actually, Belogorovka is actually in Lugansk region, but it lies on the way to Seversk. Maybe the battle for Seversk is about to restart as well. There is very interesting news and very important news from Chasiv Yar. It looks as if the Russians not only now have significantly expanded the area that they controlled on the east bank of the Seversky Donetsk Canal, south of Chasiv Yar, but that they have probably completely cleared, or almost entirely cleared, Klashevka, the village to the southwest of Bakhmut, but also that they have also advanced deep inside the micro-district. There is a film of a Ukrainian tank firing at Russian positions in what appears to be inside the micro-district. And the important thing about this is that the Ukrainian tank is clearly located close to, right on the very eastern, northeastern point of the micro district. So the tank is firing at Russian positions in what appears to be another part of the micro district, which suggests that the Russians have now captured a significant part of the micro district. Of course, it's not always easy to tell. The fog of war always lies heavy, but one senses that the days of the micro district might be ending. And in the meantime, there's reports that the Russians are now fighting inside the village of Kalinina to the west of Bogdanovka, which brings them obviously right up to the canal north of Chasiv Yar, but also that they have now finally begun that operation, which they seemed on the brink of launching roughly a year ago, during the later stages of the Battle of Bakhmut, the battle which resulted in the capture of Bakhmut, but which is that they're advancing well to the north of Chasiv Yar, but also close to the canal, and that they're now finally storming the village of Orovo Vasileva, which, to be clear, not only positions the Russians where they can also cross the canal and advance southwards towards Chasiv Yar if they choose, but also it opens another route from the east directly towards the town of Kramatorsk, the important, I should say, city of Kramatorsk, which is, I understand, where the headquarters of the entire army group, Ukrainian army group in Donbass, is actually located. So, Russian advances Chasiv Yar, intense fighting going on there, but the Russians again capitalizing on the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops to Kharkiv region. They seem to be breaking through in the micro district, which is likely to fall at some point within the next few days, bringing the Russians to the east bank of the canal, literally in the central area of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians likely to be located on the canal to the north and south of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians also poised to perhaps capture this village of Orovo Vasileva and place themselves in a position where they can strike at Kramatorsk, north of Chasiv Yar as well. So a lot going on in this part of the battlefront too. And further south still, in the Ocheretino Avdiivka area, Russian forces have been reactivated. The Russians apparently have now cleared the fields to the east of Novo-Alexandrovka, there between Novo-Alexandrovka and Arkhangelsk, the two villages that they captured some weeks ago. And the Russians apparently now again poised to restart or to pursue more actively their attack both towards Novo-Alexandrovka and towards Kalinova to the north of Arkhangelsk, placing the Russians in a strong position to outflank Ukrainian forces to the west of the important H20 highway. And further south still, Krasnogorovka, I said yesterday that it looked as if the Russians are preparing to resume the storming operation in Krasnogorovka, and the Russians are also apparently poised to clear up After capturing Netalevo and Umanske, they're about to capture the other village of Yasnobrodovka, and this puts them close to another important village, Karlovka, which is located on a reserve area, with Krasnogorovka town immediately to the south, also likely to fall fairly soon. The Russians appearing to be in a strong position to launch further attacks towards Kurachovo, city immediately to the west, and they're coming to the west of Krasnogorovka, and they're coming also very close to Kurachovo. From the east, they appear to have captured or almost captured the village of Georgievka. The smaller village of Maximilianovka is the only village now lying between the Russian forces in this area and Kurachovo. And of course, if Kurachovo is besieged, and ultimately captured, then Ukrainian positions south in Vuhledar will collapse too. So you could see Russian pressure intensifying all across the front lines. Ukrainians becoming increasingly desperate. Zelensky talking about a controlled situation, but one that is unstable. The Ukrainians worrying and fretting about a Russian advance into Kiev, and the Russians elsewhere maintaining their advances along the entire line of contact. Now, in Beijing, just before he left Beijing, Putin gave a very interesting press conference. I understand that it was exclusively with the Russian media, so he was responding exclusively. He was taking questions exclusively from the Russian media. And by the way, to those who still insist that the Russian media is entirely managed and completely controlled, if you read the entire transcript of the press conference, which you can find on the Kremlin's website, you will see that he was asked pointed questions by the media, the Russian media, and he evaded giving complete answers to all of them, to some of them. For example, he was asked questions about the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. He was basically asked, why haven't we seen the contracts completed? And yes, he said the contracts will be completed and the work has already started, but he was very careful not to go into details about discussions. He was also very careful to avoid discussing various other things that he didn't want to discuss about the general state of military operations, and about the fact, for example, that some Chinese banks have been showing unwillingness to carry out transactions with Russian clients. Anyway, let's focus on the most important things that Putin did say. So, one of the things that he talked about at very great length was the negotiations which took place in March and April 2022, and which, as he repeatedly says, almost led to an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, with a draft agreement which Ukraine initialed. And Putin goes into great detail about this. He speaks, for example, about how, again, the West basically tricked the Russians to get the Russian troops withdrawn from Kiev. And these are his words. When our troops stood near Kiev, our Western partners told us it is impossible to sign documents when the other side puts a gun to your temple. What should be done? We asked. It is necessary to withdraw troops from Kiev. We did this. On the following day, they threw all our agreements into the dustbin and said, now we will fight to the end. Their Western curators occupied the position that is now known to the whole world to defeat Russia on the battlefield, to inflict a strategic defeat on it. So let's sum up this part of my answer. We were cheated again. Now we need to understand whom and how we should deal with, whom we should trust, and to what extent. Now, Putin has been repeatedly saying over the last few months that the Russian troops withdrew from Kiev at the request of the Western powers. I've not seen a proper denial of this from any Western government. I get the sense that Putin means that or rather is referring to Germany, the German government, as the government which specifically made this request. But I would like this clarified. I would like to know whether or not this actually happened, and I appreciate that people will always say different things. The Russians and the Germans might have different stories to tell, but I would like to know what each story is, if it was the Germans, what each story is, so that I can decide between them. Again, this curtain of silence that has fallen on this affair is really unhelpful. But suffice to say that when Putin talks about the Russians being tricked into departing from Kiev, well, that does make me wonder whether all of these reports from Sumy about a Russian incursion there really are about the Russians returning to the vicinity of Kiev again. I'm not saying that's necessarily what the Russians are going to do. To repeat again, the general staff, Putin himself, don't share their plans with me. But it is interesting how Putin is harping on this issue again and again now. He did it twice, by the way, over the course of this press conference. Anyway, he also discussed the situation in Kharkiv region, and what he had to say about the fighting there was quite interesting. And here perhaps we have the Kremlin's official translation of what he said about Russian plans to capture Kharkiv. And he says, as far as developments in Kharkiv sector are concerned, the Ukrainians are to blame for these because they shelled and regrettably continue to shell residential areas in border territories of Russia, including Belgorod. Civilians are dying there. It's clear for everyone. They fire missiles right at the city center, at residential areas. I said publicly that if this continues, we will be forced to create a security zone, a sanitary zone, and this is what we are doing today. As for the seizure of Kharkiv, there are no such plans for now. So, he's leaving it open that such plans might crystallize eventually. For the moment, what the Russians are doing, or want us to believe that they're doing, is creating a buffer zone along their border. And I should say that all of their actions are consistent with this, but Putin is leaving open the possibility that eventually the Russians might decide to storm Kharkiv as well. I don't think this is the immediate plan. In fact, he's told us that it is not. There are no such plans for now, but eventually, conceivably, at some point, it might happen. So all that, again, very interesting. Now, Putin had a lot of other very interesting things to say over the course of the press conference. He talked about de-dollarization, about the misguided nature of the Western sanctions policy, about the West, in effect, trying to block China's and Russia's economic development, either through tariffs or sanctions or whatever. And he made it fairly clear that in his opinion, a lot of this is basically a disguised form of economic protectionism. He made it also very clear that despite the switch to a more planning structure, as I discussed in my program yesterday and the day before, the Russians are also now are still going to base their planning decisions on market signals. You have to read the press conference carefully to see that, but he talks about the market repeatedly. But he also said something else, which, by the way, corrected some wrong information that he gave to the military officers that he met in that meeting some days ago. Now, over the course of that meeting, Putin put the share of GDP that Russia is now devoting to the military matters, military and security matters, as he put it, at 8.7%, which, frankly, I thought was too high. I also said that the other figure he gave, that the Soviet Union was had devoted 13% of its GDP to defense and security-related investments in the mid-1980s. I said that this was a widely cited Western figure, but that I understand that academic scholarship has now revised that figure significantly down. But anyway, over the course of this press conference, Putin gave a substantially lower estimate of spending, defense spending, as a proportion of GDP, as compared with the one that he gave to the military officers that he met just 3 days ago. So, whereas when he met the officers a few days ago, he said that the share of GDP devoted to military and security spending came to 8.7% and might go still higher this year. He's now said that the defense part of this spending is a much more realistic 6.7%. And he made it clear, he again repeated that figure several times in his press conference. And I get the sense that clearly someone, quite possibly Shoigu and Belousov, came to him and told him, look, you must revise the figure, you must correct the figure that you gave to the military officers, because it's significantly too high, which it clearly is. Now, Putin then did go on to say that if you add law enforcement, and he meant by this civilian law enforcement, but also no doubt the Rosgvardia organization, which has a paramilitary role, then that raises security spending, defense and security spending, in total to just over 8%, which is still lower than the figure of 8.7 plus percent that he gave to the military officers. But, of course, I think it's questionable whether one should add law enforcement, spending on the police and all of that to a total military budget. That seems to me wrong. So why did Putin do it? Well, of course, one possibility is that when he spoke to the military officers, he didn't know the exact figures and that he got them wrong. I think it's more likely that he deliberately inflated the amount that Russia spends on defense in order to more fully explain Belousov's role. And the fact that Belousov is going to have, as defense minister, a central role in economic planning. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole topic again. I discussed it at length in my previous videos. Suffice to say that the role that Belousov is going to play is both to open up the defense ministry to more innovations, but also to ensure that the military-industrial complex supports and serves the civilian economy, the civilian industrial economy, and within the structure of an overall plan. And I'm confident, by the way, that we will get a future industrial development plan, that within the structure of that plan, it helps in the process of reindustrialization. Now, the other thing, which was extremely interesting, is that we learnt that Putin and Xi Jinping, who spent, it seems, practically an entire day in each other's continuous company, but that Putin and Xi Jinping, when they were supposed to be meeting one for one, well, it wasn't actually one for one, because both Shoigu, Putin's new Security Council secretary and former defense minister, and Belousov, the new defense minister, also attended that meeting. So I think that Putin wanted to explain the new personnel changes to Xi Jinping, but I suspect, again, part of the purpose is to help the Chinese understand the new industrial and economic planning structure that is being set up in Russia, so that the Chinese themselves can work with it better and more closely. It's likely that Xi Jinping wanted this meeting and asked to be able to speak to these officials so that he could ask them questions in order to understand their work better and to form a clearer opinion of them. And we see that that is exactly what took place. Now, I want to come back to that absolutely essential article by Ray McGovern in Consortium News, because it covers vast topics, and I should say that in the field of Russian-Chinese relations, Ray McGovern has had an absolutely stellar record. In the 1960s, as I said, he was one of the first, in fact, one of the very few at that time, to perhaps within the intelligence community, all but the only one, to say that the Sino-Soviet split was absolutely for real, that the Soviets and the Chinese were engaging in a massive falling out with each other, which indeed did prove to be the case, and which did lead to border clashes in 1969 between the Soviet and Chinese armies. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, perhaps even earlier than that, he started warning, and of course by this time he was retired, he started warning people in the West that the Chinese and the Russians were not only making it up, had not only made it up, but were forging an extremely close relationship with each other. And he was one of the very few who said that. I will give myself here a small pat on the back. I'm obviously not someone with the background or experience in this area that Ray McGovern has. But I remember I too was writing back about 10 years ago that this Russian-Chinese relationship was developing very rapidly, and that people in the West were willfully blind to the fact. Anyway, this is the sort of things that Ray McGovern said. He said Chinese President Xi Jinping's extremely warm reception of President Putin yesterday in Beijing sealed an increasingly formidable Russia-China strategic relationship. It amounts to a tectonic shift in the world balance of power. The Russia-China Entente, I rather like that phrase, Entente, because I think that describes very closely what this is. It's not a formal alliance like the relationship between France and Britain before the First World War was also not a formal alliance, but it is more than just a good relationship between neighbors. Anyway, the Russian-Chinese Entente also sounds the death knell for attempts by US foreign policy neophytes to drive a wedge between the two countries. The triangular relationship has become 2 against 1 with serious implications, particularly for the war in Ukraine. By the way, on this question of 2 against 1, 2 superpowers against 1, I remember a cover from The Economist in the 1970s, then of course also a passionately hostile to Russia in its then incarnation as the Soviet Union. That's one of the constants in media and world affairs. The Economist remains hostile to Russia, whatever its government may be. Anyway, I remember that cover, and it talked about the Sino-US relationship of that time, which, by the way, and incidentally, fell far short of the relationship between Russia and China that we're seeing today. In fact, there is simply no comparison. But anyway, The Economist then set it out in a rather interesting equation. 2 plus 3 equals 1. The United States supposedly was 2. The Economist was claiming, probably wrongly by the way, that the Soviet Union had by that point exceeded the United States in military power. But the United States, in combination with China, meant that they were more, that their aggregate military power now exceeded that of the Soviet Union. Well, I don't know that that was actually even true then. China was a major military power, and there is no doubt at all that its, as it turns out, relatively brief alignment with the United States against Russia massively complicated Soviet planning, and in my opinion, put an unbearable stress on Soviet resources. But I don't think, as I said, that in the 1970s it is accurate to say that the United States was 2 to the Soviet Union's 1. But today, I think it is still overall the case that Russia and China are significantly less powerful in military terms than the United States is. Neither yet possesses a fleet comparable to that of the United States. Neither possesses an air force fully comparable to that of the United States, though Russian strategic nuclear forces are arguably more powerful, and the Russian submarine fleet is looking also more powerful by the day. And of course, China is developing its own Navy fleet. It's just launched its first big aircraft carrier, comparable in some respects to a US supercarrier. And of course, the Russian army is evolving into an extremely powerful force. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that we are indeed in that scenario that was spoken about in The Economist, 2 + 3 = 1, only the one that is being replaced by 2 + 3 this time is the United States. It is in effect China and Russia, exactly as Ray McGovern says, coming together to contain the United States. I don't, and I want to reiterate it, I am not suggesting in any way that the United States, that the Chinese and the Russians have aggressive ideas against the United States specifically. But then comes one of the most interesting parts of Ray McGovern's article, and it covers two things of which I was basically unaware. The first relates to the summit meeting that took place between Putin and Biden in Geneva in June 2021. And this was a brief moment after Biden became president, when it looked as if the relationship between Russia and the United States might actually achieve some degree of stability and some understanding. I remember that several of us felt confident that the relationship might actually finally get past that incredibly difficult period that had begun under Obama, and which, despite Trump's own attempts, had actually got significantly worse during the presidency of Donald Trump. Anyway, it turns out that the summit meeting, or at least this is my own interpretation, but it's based on McGovern's account, that this was the meeting which apparently decided the administration to seek a hardening of the relationship with Moscow, which turned the United States, the Biden administration, fully against Moscow, against Russia. Because it seems that Biden went to that meeting in Geneva, convinced that he could play on what he believed was Russia's fear of China to drive a wedge between China and Russia. I'm now almost quoting from Ray McGovern. And the fact that this was apparently what Biden tried to do at the Geneva summit, well, this is how McGovern describes it, that Biden went to that meeting with that intention, and that he indicated that what he had told Putin during their Geneva summit, and Biden's words, which are quoted as, without quoting Putin, which I don't think is appropriate, let me ask a rhetorical question. You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China is seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world and the largest and the most powerful military in the world. And all of this was apparently said after the summit meeting, as Biden's aides tried to whisk him onto the plane, but he failed to stop him sharing his views about the Chinese-Russian relationship. And then Biden went on to say Russia is in a very, very difficult spot right now. They're being squeezed by China. And then McGovern makes the point that having been confronted in Geneva by this attempt, Geneva in June 2021, by this attempt by Biden and his team to create a wedge between them, the Chinese and the Russians went out of their way over the rest of 2021, the remaining part of 2021, to make completely clear to the US that this was simply not going to happen. And McGovern puts it like this: after these remarks, Putin and Xi spent the rest of 2021 trying to disabuse Biden of the China squeeze on Russia. It was not a squeeze, but a fraternal embrace. And this mutual effort culminated in a Xi-Putin virtual summit on the 15th of December. And the language used over the course of this virtual meeting between Putin and Xi in December 2022 was intended to make it clear once and for all to the United States that this idea that the Americans had, that the Biden administration, the Biden people had, that they could somehow detach Russia from China by playing on Russian fears of China, fears that they assume the Russians have, but which there is no real evidence that the Russians have to any great degree, at least not Putin and his people, that was simply not going to happen. Anyway, these attempts by the Chinese and the Russians to make the Biden team understand that this attempt to split the Chinese and the Russians from each other was not going to succeed. I believe that this is what ultimately, more than anything else, finally set us on the course towards the war. Because when the United States, when the Biden team began to understand in the late summer, early autumn, that Russia was not going to be detached from China, they decided that they had to take action to break Russia, to force Russia to distance itself from China. It was in the late summer of 2021 that the article by Wes Mitchell appeared in National Interest, for example, calling for Russia to be defeated in Ukraine so that the US could, in effect, gain control of Russian foreign policy in the way that Bismarck once gained control of Austrian foreign policy after the 1866 Prusso-Austrian War, redirecting so that the United States would be able to redirect Russia against China, which of course, it was widely understood, must have been widely understood, required a regime change in Moscow. Now, I'm not saying this was the only thing that led to the war. I think an important factor was the German elections, which removed from the scene Angela Merkel, who could have been relied upon to work hard to prevent a conflict in Europe. But I think it was probably the single trigger that the United States, the Biden administration, the Biden people understood that a conflict, that the only way, or came to the decision that the only way that they could break the Russian-Chinese partnership was by inflicting a defeat on Russia and doing so in Ukraine. And that, in the autumn of 2021, was when the crisis began. And then there is a fascinating event which took place also in January 2022, of which I was completely unaware. Putin and Biden had their last discussion with each other in January 2022. And over the course of that discussion, Biden gave Putin an assurance that the United States had no plans to install nuclear ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on Ukrainian territory. And Moscow, the Russians, were overjoyed with this. They saw this as the start of a breakthrough, and they felt that it was a sign that Biden himself might be coming round to adjust to their security concerns. And it seems that this was one of the facts. I should say this meeting took place in December, not January. And it was one of the things that led the Russians to hope that the Americans might take seriously the concerns that the Russians set out in their draft treaties. But it turns out, and this is based on something that Lavrov revealed only last month, but Ray McGovern has provided the details, and I'm going to read exactly what Lavrov says, what McGovern says about Lavrov. Foreign Minister Lavrov revealed last month that when he met Blinken in Geneva in January 2022, this is after this conversation with Biden, over the course of which Biden gave this apparent assurance, Blinken pretended he'd not heard of Biden's undertaking to Putin on December 30th. This is the date when the conversation between Biden and Putin took place. Rather, Blinken insisted that US medium-range missiles could be deployed in Ukraine and that the United States would only be willing to limit their number. So, in effect, Blinken told Lavrov in January 2022 that the United States did intend to install ballistic missiles, ground-based ballistic missiles, medium-range missiles, within easy distance of Moscow, in Ukraine, missiles with nuclear warheads. Well, I think from that moment, war would have become inevitable. As is obvious for the Russians, this would have been the crossing of a red line. Now, I cannot believe that even a diplomat as incompetent as Blinken is would not have understood that. If Blinken said a thing like that to Lavrov in January 2022, in the increasingly tense atmosphere that existed at that time, it's almost certain that he would have known that it would provoke a very strong Russian reaction. Almost certainly, given the already deteriorating situation in Donbass, a decision by the Russians that they had no real option but to advance into Ukraine. And when the crisis in Donbass boiled over in February with Ukrainian shelling of Donbass, well, by that point, all doubt would have been removed. And of course, when all of those people met with all that enthusiasm at the Munich Security Conference and were patting themselves on the back and were looking forward to the sanctions that were going to be imposed on Russia and to the way in which the Russians were going to be isolated globally and to the expected regime change that would soon be taking place in Moscow. Well, they would have known for an absolute certainty by that point that war was coming. Anyway, I accept and acknowledge that there's some element of my own interpretation into these events, but Ray McGovern's article in Consortium News needs to be read in itself. Its discussion of the Chinese-Russian relationship is masterly, and for that reason, I'm going to provide a link under this video. Well, thank you for joining me again today. This is where I end my program today. More from me soon. You can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble, and X. Please don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And also remember that you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.